Cologne, Germany. March 6, 1945. A ruined street running toward the twin spires of a cathedral that has somehow survived 6 years of war. A young American sits in the gunner's seat of a tank unlike any the United States Army has fielded before. He is 21 years old. He is soft-spoken to the point that men who served beside him would later struggle to believe what he did for a living. In a few seconds, he will fire a single round that newsreels will carry into theaters across America, a round that families a continent away will watch from cushioned seats, not yet knowing that one of the men in that footage is their own son. He does not know the cameras are rolling. He does not know this moment will outlive everyone in it. He knows only that a German tank has its gun pointed toward him, and that he cannot afford to wait for his own tank to stop moving before he fires. The shot he is about to take will win the most famous tank duel of the Second World War. It will be captured on film from beginning to end, one of the only complete tank versus tank duels ever recorded on motion picture film in the entire conflict, and by far the most famous. And then something strange will happen to the man who fired it. He will go home. He will say almost nothing about it for the rest of his working life. And the medal he was promised for what he did in that street will be taken away from him over a piece of chewing gum, and it will not be placed in his hands until he is 96 years old, 74 years later, standing at a memorial in Washington, expecting nothing more than to sign a few books. This is a strange shape for a war story. We are used to the hero being decorated while the guns are still warm. We are used to the brave act and the reward arriving in the same season, the same year, the same war. Here, the act and the recognition are separated by almost 3/4 of a century, and the man in the middle of it spent those decades insisting, to anyone who raised the subject, that he had done nothing remarkable at all, that anyone in his seat would have done the same. The question underneath this story is not whether he was brave. The film settles that. The question is, why a nation that recorded his single most important act and showed it to millions, then let the man who performed it slip so completely into the ordinary that he had to be found again, decades later, and reminded of who he had been. To understand why that shot mattered, and why the man who fired it was so easy to overlook, you have to understand the machine he was sitting in and the long, unglamorous argument that put him there. For most of the war, American tank crews fought at a disadvantage they understood intimately and could do very little about. The standard American tank was the M4 Sherman. It was reliable. It was easy to build. It could be produced in numbers that no German factory could match, shipped across an ocean, and repaired in the field by men who were not trained mechanics. Those were real virtues, and they helped win the war. But the Sherman, in its most common versions, carried a gun in the 75 or 76 mm class, and against the thick frontal armor of the heavier German tanks, that gun was often not enough. Crews learned that their best hope against a German Panther or Tiger was to maneuver, to work a shot into the side or the rear, where the armor was thinner, because a straight duel from the front was a duel they were likely to lose. A gunner named Clarence Smoyer put it plainly in later years. Their best hope, he said, was for a side shot or a rear shot. From the front, the odds were bad. It is worth pausing on how that disadvantage actually felt to the men who lived inside it, because it explains the quiet dread that hung over every advance into country where German armor might be waiting. The Panther had entered the war in 1943, and it combined 3 things that American crews could not match all at once. Its long 75 mm gun could punch through the front of a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own rounds simply bounced off the Panther's sloped glacis. Its frontal armor was angled so steeply that even a good hit tended to skid away rather than bite. And in the hands of an experienced crew, it could kill first and kill cleanly from a concealed position before an American tank even understood that it was in a fight. American crews responded the only way they could, with numbers and with maneuver. They learned to move in groups, so that while a Panther was killing one Sherman, another Sherman might work around to its flank. It was a grim arithmetic, and it was paid in the lives of tank crews who did everything right and died anyway because their machine had been sent to war undergunned. Men who fought in Sherman's spoke, then and afterward, of the particular fear of hearing that there were German heavies ahead, because they knew the exchange rate of that meeting was not in their favor. The Pershing was the Army's belated answer to precisely that fear, and it arrived so late in the war that only a handful of crews would ever fire one in anger before the fighting in Europe ended. Clarence Smoyer knew this better than almost anyone, because by early 1945 he had become, in the description of his biographer, the most lethal American tank gunner of the war. That is a claim made by the author who told his story, Adam Makos, rather than an official finding of the Army, but it rested on a real record. Smoyer was credited with destroying roughly 5 German tanks over his time in combat, and he had survived where a great many gunners did not. He was born in June of 1923 in Perryville, Pennsylvania, in the anthracite coal country of the eastern part of the state, and he grew up in the nearby town of Lehighton. He was a big man, gentle in manner, the kind of person who drew no attention to himself in a room. He was called up in 1943, and he trained at Fort Knox in Kentucky. He turned out to have a gift that had nothing to do with his temperament. He could shoot. He could read a battlefield through a gun sight and put a round where it needed to go, quickly, under pressure, when the men around him were shouting and the target was moving and there was no time to think. He fought from Normandy onward, through the murderous hedgerow country, through the winter fighting, and into Germany itself. He served in Company E of the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Armored Regiment, part of the 3rd Armored Division, a formation that had earned the nickname Spearhead for the way it was repeatedly thrust to the front of the American advance. His tank was commanded by a staff sergeant named Robert Early. The crew had a reputation as a steady, experienced team, the kind of crew that other crews were built around, and Smoyer himself would end the war as one of the few original members of his crew still in the same tank, the others having been rotated away to lead or fill other crews as losses thinned the ranks around them. Survival at that level of the war was not only luck, it was skill and a certain hard discipline, and the two things reinforced each other, because a crew that made fewer mistakes lived longer, and a crew that lived longer accumulated the experience that prevented mistakes. The division he served in had earned its nickname, the Hard Way. The 3rd Armored Division had come ashore in Normandy in the summer of 1944 and had been thrown into the worst of the hedgerow fighting, where the close, blind country favored the defender and armor could be ambushed at a few yards' range from behind an earthen bank. It had fought through the breakout from Normandy, helped close the Falaise pocket, raced across France, and battered its way into Germany through the fortified belt along the frontier. By the time it reached the approaches to Cologne, it had been in more or less constant contact with the enemy for the better part of 9 months, and it had paid for every mile. To be at the tip of the spearhead was to be, statistically, in one of the most dangerous jobs in the American Army, and the crews who survived long enough to be handed the new Pershings had done so by learning lessons that could not be taught in any school at Fort Knox. They had learned them from the men who had not survived. And in the late winter of 1945, there was a new piece of equipment to assign. The United States had finally begun sending a heavier tank to Europe, a tank built to stand in a straight fight with the German heavies that had outmatched the Sherman for so long. It was called the M26 Pershing. It carried a 90mm gun, a weapon in a different class from the 75. A complete round for that gun weighed roughly 43 pounds, and its armor-piercing shot left the barrel at around 2,800 feet per second. Its upper front hull carried about 4 inches of armor, roughly 102 millimeters, and that plate was sloped back at a sharp angle, which made it far more effective than its thickness alone would suggest. For the first time, an American tank crew could sit still, face a German heavy across an open street, and have a real expectation that their round would punch through, and that the enemy's round might not. But this was not yet a standard tank. It was an experiment. The decision to build and field it had been fought over for years inside the Army's own bureaucracy, delayed by disagreements over doctrine and priorities that had kept better-armed tanks out of American hands longer than many crews would have liked. The argument, stripped to its essentials, had been about what a tank was for. One school of thought inside the American Army had held that tanks existed chiefly to exploit breakthroughs and race into the enemy's rear, and that the job of fighting other tanks belonged to specialized anti-tank units and to towed guns and tank destroyers. By that logic, the Sherman did not need a heavier gun because killing German armor was somebody else's task. The reality of the fighting in Europe had demolished that tidy division of labor. Tanks met tanks constantly, whether the doctrine wished them to or not, and when they did, the Sherman crews discovered that the theory which had spared them a bigger gun was written in their own blood. By the time the lesson was fully absorbed and a heavier tank was rushed into production and across the Atlantic, the war in Europe had only a few months left to run. The Pershing was, in that sense, a weapon that arrived almost too late to matter, a correction to a mistake that had already been paid for many times over. That it reached Clarence Smoyer's crew at all, and that it reached them in time for one of the most famous engagements of the war, was a matter of timing so narrow that it barely happened. Even now, in early 1945, only a small number of Pershings were being sent to prove the concept in combat. 20 of them crossed the Atlantic under a program known as the Zebra Mission, and they were divided evenly, 10 going to the 3rd Armored Division and 10 to the 9th Armored Division. Because the Pershings were so few and so untested, they were handed to crews who had earned them through experience. Early's crew was chosen. Clarence Smoyer, the quiet gunner from the coal country, was put behind the 90mm gun. Their new tank carried a name painted on its hull, Eagle 7. The crew that climbed into Eagle 7 were men Smoyer had come to know the way soldiers know one another, which is to say completely and without sentiment. The loader was John DeRiggi from Pennsylvania. The driver was William McVeigh from Michigan. The bow gunner and radio operator was Homer Davis from Kentucky, a man the others called Smokey. Robert Early commanded from the turret. They were an ordinary cross-section of the American Army that had been assembled out of small towns and delivered to the far end of a broken continent, and by March of 1945, they had been at war long enough to have no illusions left about any of it. That a marksman of Smoyer's ability was sitting in that seat at all was not an accident. It was the late product of an argument the American Army had been having with itself, quietly, for decades, about how infantry and armor should actually fight. And to see why Smoyer's single shot in Cologne became such a symbol, it helps to understand that the Army had spent years building toward a kind of soldier who could deliver exactly that shot, in exactly that moment, and had done so during a period when most of the world was paying attention to entirely different things. The American Army between the two world wars was not an institution anyone feared. In 1939, it ranked 17th in the world by size, smaller than the Army of Romania. It was starved of money through the long years of the Depression, overlooked in the national budget, and low in prestige. Ambitious young men did not, on the whole, dream of careers in it. But in certain corners of that neglected institution, a small number of officers took the lessons of the previous war seriously in a way that would matter enormously later. They studied their own casualty records from the First World War. They noticed something about modern combat that ran against every romantic image of soldiers standing in ranks and firing at visible enemies. On a real battlefield, they concluded, the enemy is mostly invisible. He is in a trench, a hedge, a cellar, a fold in the ground. Most fire on both sides went towards suspected positions rather than confirmed ones. The rounds that did the killing were simply the ones that happened to land where a man actually was. That observation shaped American weapons and American training in ways that came due in 1944 and 1945. It led the Army to adopt a semi-automatic rifle, the M1 Garand, as its standard infantry weapon, the only major combatant to arm its ordinary soldiers that way for the whole of the war. It led to a doctrine that valued volume of fire, the ability to put a great deal of metal into a suspected position quickly, over the careful, conserved fire that older armies prized. And in the world of tanks and gunnery, it produced training that prized speed and decisiveness in the gunner's seat above almost everything else. The man who could find the target fast and fire first was the man the whole system was designed to produce. Clarence Smoyer was that man, whether or not anyone thought to say so at the time. The system had been built to make his kind of shot possible. It would fall to him, one morning in a wrecked German city, to actually make it. Now hold that in mind, the quiet marksman in the experimental tank, and turn to the city he was about to enter, because the setting is a large part of why the world remembered what happened there. Cologne was Germany's fourth largest city before the war, home to somewhere between 770,000 and 800,000 people. By March of 1945, it was the corpse of a city. It had been bombed again and again, in more than 260 separate air raids over the course of the war, until whole districts were reduced to canyons of broken masonry standing open to the sky. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs had fallen on it. Roughly 20,000 people had died under those raids, and of the living, all but about 20,000 had fled or been evacuated, so that a city built for the better part of 1 million souls now sheltered a remnant hiding in cellars beneath the rubble. 91 of the city's 150 churches had been wrecked, and in the middle of all that devastation, improbably, stood the Cologne Cathedral. Its twin Gothic spires had risen over the city for centuries. They had been so prominent that Allied bomber crews used them as a navigation landmark, which is part of why the cathedral itself, though struck many times, was never deliberately leveled. Around it almost everything had been flattened, yet the cathedral still stood, scarred and battered but recognizably itself, the most visible thing for miles in any direction. The American drive into Cologne was part of a larger operation called Lumberjack, an offensive by the 1st United States Army to reach the Rhine River and close up along its western bank. The spearhead of that drive, fittingly, was the 3rd Armored Division under Major General Maurice Rose, and at the very tip of the spearhead were a handful of tanks, including the new Pershings. The German forces left to defend the west bank of the city were not a fresh army. They were the worn remnants of battered units, stiffened by local militia and by a small number of tanks, including at least one Panther positioned near the cathedral itself. The German command understood that the west bank of Cologne could not be held for long. The bridges over the Rhine behind them were already being destroyed to deny them to the Americans. The Great Hohenzollern Bridge, which had carried rail and foot traffic across the river beside the cathedral, would be blown by German engineers. The Panther near the cathedral was, in a real sense, defending a symbol and covering a withdrawal rather than holding a line that could change the war. The larger prize that spring was the Rhine itself. The river was the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland, a wide and fast-moving obstacle that had guarded the western edge of Germany for as long as there had been armies in Europe. Allied planners expected that crossing it would be a costly and deliberate operation, requiring boats and bridging equipment and a hard fight on the far bank, because they assumed the Germans would destroy every bridge behind them as they retreated. Reaching the west bank quickly and clearing the cities along it was the necessary first step. Cologne was the largest of those cities, and taking it was both a military objective and a psychological one, a demonstration that the war had arrived, finally and irreversibly, in the great cities of Germany itself. For the American soldiers fighting through the rubble, though, the grand strategy was invisible. What they saw was one more ruined street, one more crossroads that might hide an anti-tank gun or a Panther, one more chance to be killed within weeks of the war's obvious end. That was the particular cruelty of the late war fighting. Every man in it could see that Germany was beaten, and every man in it knew that being beaten did not stop the enemy's guns from firing, and that a soldier could die just as completely in March of 1945 as he could have died in 1942. But a Panther was a Panther, and no American crew took one lightly. It mounted a long, high-velocity 75mm gun, one of the best tank guns of the war, capable of destroying an American tank in a single shot from the front at the ranges involved in a city fight. Its own frontal armor was thick and steeply sloped. It had already proven exactly what it could do on the morning of March 6th, before Clarence Smoyer ever reached the cathedral square, and it is that earlier moment that gives the duel its full weight and its meaning. Two American Shermans had pushed toward the cathedral ahead of the Pershing, moving up a street partly blocked by rubble. They were forced to slow and bunch where the debris narrowed the way. The Panther was waiting for exactly that, positioned in ambush with its gun already laid down the street. It fired. The rounds tore into the lead Sherman, which was commanded by a young lieutenant named Karl Kellner, a man from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Kellner was not a green replacement. He had come up the hard way, landing in Normandy as a sergeant and earning a battlefield commission to lieutenant only weeks before, in February of 1945. He had been wounded twice in the fighting across France and had returned to his unit each time, and he had been decorated with the Silver Star for bravery. He was 26 years old. The German gun killed men inside, that Sherman instantly. Kellner himself had his leg severed by the hit. He managed to get out of the burning tank and onto the pavement, where a reporter reached him and tried to help. That reporter was Andy Rooney, then a young correspondent for the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes, who would become famous to a later American generation on television. Rooney helped move the wounded lieutenant to some cover, but the injury was mortal, and Kellner died there, in the rubble of a foreign city, within sight of the cathedral, minutes after the shot that killed him. Two more of his crew were killed inside the tank. A second Sherman coming up behind him had its tracks shot out and was left disabled. Andy Rooney never forgot it. He had seen a great deal of the war by that point, and he would write about it for the rest of his life. But the death of Karl Kellner in the street at Cologne stayed with him as one of the sharpest and most personal losses he witnessed. The death of a specific young man he had knelt beside and could not save. It is a reminder that behind the famous footage of the duel that was about to follow, there was already a fresh grave being dug, and that the Panther which Clarence Smoyer was ordered to destroy had, only minutes earlier, killed men whose names and faces were known to the Americans closing in on it. The duel that the newsreels would turn into a clean and almost cinematic contest of machines was, on the ground, an act of grim necessity carried out over the bodies of men who had died moments before. In a matter of seconds, the Panther had shown, once again, the exact thing that American crews had learned to fear above all else. Straight ahead, from the front, the German tank won. Word of the ambush reached Eagle 7, one street over. The Pershing was ordered to deal with the Panther. And now the two theories of tank fighting that we have been tracing came together in a single intersection of ruined streets near the cathedral. The old Sherman doctrine said, maneuver, get to the flank, and never take a German heavy from the front if you can possibly avoid it. The new Pershing offered something different, a gun and armor that made a frontal fight survivable for the first time. But doctrine and hardware only get a crew to the corner. What happens in the corner depends on the man behind the gun and on the fractions of a second in which everything is decided. Sergeant Early did what a careful commander does. He dismounted and went forward on foot to scout, trying to find a way to bring the Pershing into position at an angle that would let Smoyer strike the Panther in its more vulnerable side, rather than trading shots head-on. A cameraman went forward as well, a Signal Corps photographer named Jim Bates of the 165th Photographic Signal Company. Bates found a spot where he could see the open ground near the cathedral, set up his motion picture camera, and began to film. He did not know he was about to record the most famous few seconds of tank combat in the entire war. He knew only that an American tank was about to move into the open against a German one, and that it was worth capturing. The plan for a clean flank shot fell apart in the way plans do. As Eagle 7 rolled forward into the clearing near the cathedral, the Panther's turret was already turning to meet it. By the time the Pershing came into full view, the German gun was traversing toward the American tank. The two machines were close, closer than tank crews usually fought, close enough that there would be no long-range maneuvering and no comfortable second chances. It came down to the oldest question in gunnery: who fires first, and who fires true? Inside the Panther, in the seconds that mattered most, the German commander hesitated. His name was Wilhelm Bartelboth, a reserve lieutenant, a Leutnant der Reserve, and he had never seen a Pershing before in his life. The new American tank had a low, heavy silhouette that did not match the Sherman shape he knew and expected. For a critical moment, he was not certain what he was looking at. According to his own daughter, speaking many years later in a German documentary about the battle, Bartelborth thought the strange tank rounding into view might actually be German. That instant of doubt, the narrow gap between seeing and firing, was the gap that Clarence Smoyer needed. It should be said plainly that this account of the commander's hesitation comes from family memory relayed after the war rather than from any battlefield record, but it fits the circumstances closely because the Pershing truly was so new that even American infantry sometimes mistook it for an enemy machine. Inside Eagle 7, there was no time for the careful, stationary shot that a gunner prefers above all others. The driver, William McVeigh, understood at once that a stopped tank in that intersection was a dead tank, an easy mark for the Panther's gun. So instead of braking, McVeigh pushed the throttle down and drove the Pershing forward, keeping it moving across the open ground. That decision very likely saved them, and it also robbed Smoyer of the one thing every gunner wants: a still and steady platform from which to aim. He could not wait for the tank to halt and settle under him. The Panther's gun was right there, swinging onto them, so Clarence Smoyer laid his sight onto the German tank and fired on the move. To understand what that sentence actually contains, you have to understand how hard a shot it was. Firing a tank gun accurately while the tank is moving is one of the most difficult things a gunner can be asked to do, because every bump and lurch of the hull throws the aim off, and the gunner must somehow read all of that motion and fire in the fraction of a second when the sight crosses the target. Modern tanks solve this problem with computers and stabilized guns that hold the aim steady no matter what the hull does beneath them. Smoyer had none of that. He had a sight, a hand traverse, and his own trained judgment, and he had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds before the Panther's gun finished swinging onto Eagle 7. He put his first round into the target under those conditions, on the move, against a tank whose gun was already pointed at him. It was the kind of shot that separated the gunners who lived from the gunners who did not, and he made it look, on the film, almost easy. The first 90mm round crossed the short distance and struck the Panther low, near the gun shield. Then his following rounds tore into the hull and the engine compartment. It was exactly the kind of hit the 90mm gun had been sent to Europe to make, a killing blow of the sort the older, lighter guns could rarely manage against a Panther from the front. Smoyer did not stop with one round. As Dirigi slammed fresh shells into the breech, Smoyer fired again, and then a third time, driving rounds into the German tank to be absolutely certain that no one inside it could recover and return fire. The Panther began to burn, flames pouring from it, and it would go on burning into the next day, a blackened hulk sitting in the open before the cathedral, photographed and filmed and turned almost at once into one of the defining images of the war's end in the West. Of the Panther's 5-man crew, the accounts differ on exactly how many lived and how many died. At least one crewman was killed inside the tank, and another was terribly burned as the men bailed out. Bartelborth, the commander whose fatal moment of doubt had cost him the duel, escaped the flames and was captured, and he lived a long life afterward, surviving into old age. It is worth remembering that he was a real man too, and not simply the losing figure in someone else's famous footage. He had been a reserve officer, a citizen pulled into uniform, sitting in a tank in a hopeless position defending a city that could not be held, on a morning when the outcome of the war was no longer in any doubt. His hesitation, if his daughter's account is right, came from a very human place. The simple uncertainty of a man who could not be sure whether the shape rounding the corner was friend or enemy. He guessed wrong, and it cost him his tank and very nearly his life, and he spent the decades afterward as a survivor of a moment that millions of strangers had watched without ever knowing his name. The footage that made Clarence Smoyer anonymous made Wilhelm Bartelborth anonymous in exactly the same way, a figure in the enemy tank, an outcome rather than a person. When old soldiers from the two sides were later brought together, it was in part an attempt to give the names back to the figures in the film, to insist that every silhouette in that footage had been a frightened young man in a machine, doing what he had been sent to do, on the last brutal stretch of the longest war in history. And all of it, the Pershing rolling into the open, the muzzle flashes, the strike on the Panther, the smoke rising in front of the cathedral, was on film. Jim Bates had captured the entire exchange from beginning to end. When the footage was processed and released, it ran in newsreels across the United States, and audiences sitting in darkened theaters watched a real tank duel unfold in a ruined German city, in motion, from start to finish, something no home-front audience had ever truly been shown before. There is a reason the footage struck people so hard, and it has to do with how war had been shown up to that point. Home-front audiences were used to newsreels, but the newsreels they knew were mostly of marching men, of guns firing toward an unseen enemy, of planes overhead and ships at sea, of aftermath rather than the thing itself. What Bates had captured was different in kind. It was a duel between two individual machines, fought at close range in a recognizable place, with a clear beginning and a clear and violent end, all of it unfolding in real time in front of the camera. The great Gothic cathedral standing in the background gave it the quality of a stage set, as though the whole thing had been arranged for an audience, when in fact it had been arranged by nothing but the accident of where a cameraman had chosen to stand. In later years, a few people would even suggest, wrongly, that the duel must have been staged for the camera, so complete and so composed did the footage appear. It had not been staged, it had been real, and men had died in it, and its cinematic perfection was the purest luck. But that suggestion, mistaken as it was, is a measure of how unlike ordinary combat footage the sequence looked, and of why it lodged itself so permanently in the memory of everyone who saw it. In a Pennsylvania theater, Clarence Smoyer's own sister-in-law was watching the newsreel when she recognized him in the American tank and cried out that it was him, using the family nickname for him. She persuaded the theater owner to run the reel again so that his parents, who had reportedly never been inside a movie theater, could come and see with their own eyes that their son was alive. It is worth being precise here about what this shot did and did not do, because the truth is remarkable enough without inflation, and because the honest version is the version that holds up to scrutiny. Smoyer's shot did not, by itself, decide the battle for Cologne. The west bank of the city was already falling. The German defense was already collapsing and pulling back across the river. The Rhine bridges at Cologne, including the great Hohenzollern beside the cathedral, were already being demolished by German engineers, so the Panther crew had nothing left behind them to retreat to, and nothing left in front of the cathedral to defend but a symbol. In the cold accounting of strategy, the duel was one small action inside a much larger and already decided advance. There is a related point that popular tellings sometimes get wrong, and it is worth correcting. The famous intact bridge that American troops seized around this time, the one that let the army pour across the Rhine ahead of schedule, was not at Cologne at all. It was the railway bridge at Remagen, captured the very next day, March 7th, by the 9th Armored Division, some miles to the south. The Cologne duel did not open a river crossing. That was a separate event, in a different place, by different men. So the honest framing is this. The duel at the cathedral did not change the map of Germany, but it settled several things that were entirely real. It ended the last organized armored resistance in front of that cathedral. It answered, within the same hour and on the same ground, the killing of Lieutenant Kellner and his crew. And it proved, on film, in front of the entire American public, that the long and bitter argument over sending a heavier tank had been correct. Here was the 90mm gun doing precisely what its advocates had promised for years, defeating a German heavy from the front, in the open, in a fair fight that a Sherman would very likely have lost. The shot was decisive not for the fate of a nation, but for the men in that square, and for the meaning that a watching country would attach to it. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one of them needs to be exaggerated to matter. Now here is where the shape of this story turns, and where it stops being simply a battle story and becomes something stranger and more human than a battle story usually allows. Clarence Smoyer was told he would receive the Bronze Star for what he had done at Cologne. It was the natural recognition for a gunner who had won a duel like that, in front of witnesses and cameras, and it should have been the simple end of the matter. And then, in the days that followed, the recognition was quietly taken away, and the reason it was taken away is almost impossible to believe for its smallness. Smoyer, this gentle man from the coal country, was seen giving chewing gum to German children in the ruined city. Hungry children in a defeated city had begged the American soldiers for it, and he had handed some over. A military policeman charged him with fraternization, the forbidden contact with the enemy population that regulations of the moment prohibited. Over bubble gum handed to hungry children, the recommendation for his medal was withdrawn. His tank commander received a Bronze Star for that period. Jim Bates, the cameraman, received a Bronze Star for the footage. The gunner who had actually fired the shot, the man at the very center of the image the whole country had seen, received nothing at all. And Smoyer, entirely in character, did not make a fuss about it. He went home after the war. He went back to Pennsylvania. He took up ordinary work and lived an ordinary life, and he became, in the fullest possible sense, the quiet American gunner. He rarely spoke about the war. When war movies came on the television, he changed the channel. When fireworks went off on the 4th of July, he closed the windows against the sound of them. The images and the noise that thrilled other people took him somewhere he did not want to go. He carried the memory of that street, and of Kellner's burning Sherman, and of the men inside the Panther, privately and without ceremony, for decades. The man whom the newsreels had made briefly and anonymously famous had made himself, deliberately and by his own steady choice, invisible. This is the quiet at the very center of the story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is nearly the opposite of how we habitually imagine a war hero. There was no swagger in him, and no appetite for the telling of it. When the footage of the duel was shown to him again, late in his life, more than 50 years after the fact, he did not react with pride. He said it brought chills to his body. He said that it took him right back to the awful feelings, all the bad stuff at once. The most famous few seconds of tank combat in the war were, to the one man who had fired the winning shot, not a trophy to be admired, but a wound he would rather not reopen. He had done his job in that street. He had done it about as well as it could be done by anyone, and then he had spent the next 50 years of his life trying not to think about it. The war had given him plenty that he did not want to revisit. He had gone into combat as a very young man and had done a job that required him, again and again, to be the one who fired first and fired accurately, which meant that he had been the direct cause of a great many deaths on the other side of his gun sight. A man can understand perfectly well that this was his duty, that the men he killed were trying just as hard to kill him and his crew, that in the brutal logic of the war, it was them or him, and still carry the weight of it privately for the rest of his life. Smoyer was that kind of man. He did not pretend the killing had not happened, and he did not dress it up as anything other than what it was. He had been good at a terrible task, and being good at it had kept him and his crew alive, and he had come home and closed the windows against the fireworks and changed the channel when the war came on, and he had lived with all of it in the quiet way that so many of that generation lived with what they had seen and done. For most of those decades, the wider world had no real idea who he was. The footage was famous. The gunner was anonymous. The duel at Cologne appeared in documentaries and in books, described accurately enough as a landmark moment of the war in the West, and the specific human being who had aimed the gun went unnamed in most of them, reduced to a figure in a tank, a pair of hands on a gun sight, an outcome without a person attached. He had been overlooked, not because anyone bore him any ill will, but because the machinery that had filmed him and celebrated the image had never quite bothered to walk back to the man himself, to learn his name and give him what he was plainly owed. The picture had been enough. The picture was the story as far as the world was concerned, and the picture did not require a name. That began to change only late in his life, when a historian and author named Adam Makos set out to reconstruct the full story of the Cologne duel from both sides at once. Makos went looking for the surviving participants while a few of them were still alive to be found. He found Clarence Smoyer, the quiet gunner, still living, still soft-spoken, still deeply reluctant to call himself anything special at all. Marcos would later describe how genuinely difficult it was to reconcile the gentle old man sitting in front of him with the combat record attached to his name, how hard it was to believe that this calm and kindly person had been a legendary tank gunner. But the difficulty was the point. That gap between the deadly precision of the young gunner and the gentleness of the old man was the truth of him, not a contradiction in him. Marcos did something else as well, something that went beyond simply recording history. He helped bring together men who had been on opposite sides of that fighting so that they could meet not as enemies, but as old men who had survived the same terrible morning. In the years that followed, Smoyer traveled back to Cologne, and there he met a German veteran named Gustav Schäfer. It is important to be exact about this, because it is easy to get wrong. Schäfer had not been in the Panther that Smoyer destroyed. He had been the bow gunner and radio operator in a German Panzer IV, a different tank that had exchanged fire in the same swirling action in the streets nearby. The two men, the American gunner and the German crewman, both now old, stood together in the city where they had once tried to kill each other, and they found, as such men often do, that there was no hatred left in either of them to sustain. What drew those two old soldiers together was not the tank duel at all, but a death that neither of them had ever been able to put down. In the chaos of that morning in Cologne, as the tanks fired in the streets near the cathedral, a civilian car had driven into the crossfire. Inside it was a young German woman named Katharina Esser, 26 years old, the youngest of 4 sisters, a grocery clerk who was taking evening classes toward a degree. The car was struck in the shooting and she was killed. Both Smoyer, firing from the American tank, and Schäfer, firing from the German one, had put rounds toward that car, and neither man could ever be certain which of them had fired the shots that killed her. For decades, each of them had carried the private fear that it had been his own round. When they finally met, they made a kind of quiet agreement to share the weight of it between them, rather than let either man carry it alone. Think about what that reveals concerning the character of Clarence Smoyer. He had destroyed German tanks. He had won, on film, the most famous armored duel of the war. He had beaten a Panther from the front, the very thing his fellow crews had spent years learning to avoid. And of all the things he had done in the war, the one that haunted him most across the whole of his long life was not any of the enemy soldiers he had beaten in a fair fight. It was a young woman in a car whose death he could not even be sure he had caused. That is not the conscience of a man who thought of war as glory or of himself as its hero. It is the conscience of a man who understood, with terrible precision, exactly what his skill had been capable of costing, and who never once let himself off the hook for it. When Smoyer and Schäfer visited Katharina Esser's grave together, they laid flowers there, and her family, rather than blaming the two old soldiers, offered them a kind of forgiveness, saying that the blame belonged to the men who had started the war, and not to the young soldiers who had been sent to fight it. And then, at long last, there was the matter of the medal, still unresolved after nearly 70 years. As the full story of Cologne became widely known again through Marcos's work, an effort took shape to correct the old injustice, to give Clarence Smoyer the Bronze Star that had been promised, and then snatched away from him over a stick of gum in the spring of 1945. The effort made its way through the slow machinery that these things require, with help from the office of a United States Senator from his home state. And in September of 2019, Clarence Smoyer, by then 96 years old, traveled to Washington under the impression that he was simply going to sign copies of a book about the battle. What waited for him instead was a full Army honor guard at the National World War II Memorial. Nearly 75 years after the duel at the cathedral, the Bronze Star that had been promised and then withdrawn was finally pinned onto the chest of the man who had earned it, awarded with the device that marks an act of valor. The gunner who had spent his entire adult life insisting he was nothing special stood at last inside the recognition he had been denied as a young man. And, true to everything he had been for the whole of his quiet life, he immediately turned the moment away from himself. Receiving the honor, he said that it was really for the young men who had been killed over there, the ones who never got to come home and grow old and be found again by history. He accepted the medal in their name rather than in his own. At the same ceremony, the families of his crewmates who had since died, the men of Eagle 7, received bronze stars on their behalf, so that the recognition reached the whole crew and not only its most famous member. Clarence Smoyer died in September of 2022, at the age of 99, one of the last living links to that street and that shot and that burning tank before the cathedral. He had lived long enough to be found again, to be named, to be thanked, and to hand his medal, at least in spirit, to the dead who could no longer receive their own. The long quiet that he had wrapped around himself had been broken, gently and just barely, and just in time. So what are we finally to make of the shape of this story, now that we have followed it all the way from the gunner's seat in 1945 to the honor guard in 2019? It would be easy, and not entirely wrong, to tell it as a simple tale of a hero delayed, a good man who at long last received his due. That is true as far as it goes, but there is something more precise and more unsettling underneath it, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is the real reason a man so thoroughly documented could go so long unseen. The thing that made Clarence Smoyer visible to history was never the same thing that made him remarkable. What made him visible was, in the end, an accident of position. A cameraman named Jim Bates happened to be standing at the right intersection at the right second, and so a duel that was, in the honest judgment of the historians who have studied it, broadly similar to countless other tank fights of the war, became the single one that everyone saw. Bates gave the moment its immortality, and he deserves the credit for it. But the film, for all its power, could only capture the shot. It could not capture the man. It could show a single shot of steel crossing a square and striking a panther in the flank. It could not show the years of training and hard-won instinct that let a gunner make that hit while his own tank was still rolling beneath him. It could not show the gentleness that would, days later, hand chewing gum to hungry children and lose a medal for the offense. It could not show the 50 years of closed windows on the 4th of July, or the private guilt over a young woman's death he was never sure was his doing. The camera recorded the easiest part of Clarence Smoyer to see, and it missed almost everything that actually made him who he was. That is the deeper reason he was overlooked, and it reaches well beyond one gunner in one tank on one morning. We tend, as people, to remember the visible moment and to forget the invisible person standing behind it. We freeze a man into a few seconds of film, and then, without meaning to, we mistake the film for the man. The American Army had spent decades quietly building towards soldiers who could deliver exactly the shot that Smoyer delivered, and then, having filmed the shot and shown it to millions, it let the soldier himself walk home into complete anonymity over a technicality about candy. The image was famous within weeks. The human being took 74 years to catch up to it. There is a final irony folded into all of this, and it is the particular kind of irony that the honest version of history tends to produce, rather than the flattering version. The very footage that made the Cologne duel famous, the footage that guaranteed the world would remember the event forever, is the same footage that allowed the world to forget the man at the center of it. Because the image was so complete, so vivid, so endlessly watchable and reproducible, it seemed to be the whole of the story. It seemed that there was nothing further left to ask. A tank fired, a tank burned, the war rolled onward. Only when a historian finally went looking behind those famous seconds did it become clear just how much they had quietly concealed. The quiet gunner had been hidden not in spite of his fame, but precisely because of it. The picture was so good, so apparently complete, that almost no one ever thought to go looking for the person inside it. Clarence Smoyer told the truth about himself for his entire life, and almost nobody listened until the very end of it. He said over and over, in more or less the same words each time, that he had simply done his job. He said that anyone sitting in the gunner's seat that morning would have done the same as he had done. He said that they had been soldiers doing their duty, and that this was all it had been. He meant every word of it. And in a certain sense he was exactly right, because the entire machinery of that army, the long argument over the heavier tank, the 90mm gun, the Zebra mission that carried it to Europe, the training that prized the fast and certain shot above all else, had all existed precisely so that the outcome of such a moment would not have to depend on any single extraordinary man. The system had been built so that an ordinary soldier, well-trained and well-equipped, could win that duel. That was the entire design. But it still took a particular ordinary man, in a particular ruined intersection, moving forward when he could not afford to stop, facing a gun already turning onto him, to actually make the shot when the whole of it came down to a few seconds and there was no one else to do it. The design put the tank in the square. Clarence Smoyer fired it true, and then he went home and said almost nothing, and allowed the world to go on mistaking the film for the man, until at last, at 96, with an honor guard around him and a Bronze Star 74 years late, finally resting over his heart, the quiet American gunner was seen, for once, not as an image, but as a person. And in that moment, being seen at last, he did the one thing that was truest to everything he had ever been. He handed the whole of it over to the dead, and kept for himself only what he had always claimed, that he had simply done his duty, and that anyone might have done the same.